The third inspector showed up before breakfast, and that was the moment I realized someone in the HOA had made a very expensive mistake. The sound of horses shifting inside the stables mixed with the steady clink of metal buckets as I stepped out into the cool morning air. A thin layer of fog still hung over the pasture, turning the rolling fields behind my property silver under the rising sun. My name is Ethan Calloway. Most people in our community knew me as the guy who owned the horse stables on the edge of the neighborhood. They saw a man in work boots, a faded denim shirt, and a pickup truck covered in dust from the riding trails. They saw someone who spent mornings repairing fences, feeding horses, and hauling hay. What they did not see was everything that happened after I drove away from the stables each day. The inspector standing at my gate did not know any of that either. He held a clipboard, glanced toward the barns, and introduced himself politely. According to the paperwork in his hand, another complaint had been filed regarding potential violations involving stable operations. I almost laughed. It was the third inspection in less than 2 weeks. The first had found nothing. The second had found nothing. I already knew exactly how the third one would end. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted across the property as I escorted him through every building. We checked permits. We reviewed records. We inspected feed storage areas, fencing, drainage systems, and riding facilities. Everything was compliant. Everything had been compliant for years. 90 minutes later, the inspector thanked me for my cooperation and admitted there were no violations to report. As his vehicle disappeared down the road, I noticed another car parked near the entrance to the neighborhood. A white luxury SUV. I did not need to see the driver to know who it belonged to. Linda Parker, president of the HOA. Over the previous several months, Linda had developed an unusual interest in my stables. Every community meeting seemed to include comments about property standards. Every newsletter contained reminders about neighborhood appearance. Every conversation somehow found its way back to horses, barns, or land use. At first, I assumed she simply disliked the stables. Then the inspection started. Then the complaints started. Then the letters started arriving. The strange part was that none of it made sense. My property existed long before most of the neighborhood had been built. Every permit was current. Every regulation had been followed. Yet Linda kept pushing. Later that afternoon, I stood beside the main paddock watching several horses move through the pasture while warm sunlight spread across the fields. The peaceful scene felt completely disconnected from the growing campaign aimed at my property. Across the road, perfectly landscaped homes lined quiet streets. Somewhere inside that neighborhood, Linda was probably planning her next complaint. I shook my head and smiled. What she did not know was that I had spent my entire career dealing with difficult people who underestimated me. And unlike Linda, I already knew something very interesting about her family. Something that would make this entire situation far more complicated before it was over. The truth was, I never intended to keep any secrets from my neighbors. I simply never saw a reason to talk about my corporate career. The stables were where I felt most like myself. Long before sunrise each morning, I walked the barns while horses shifted quietly in their stalls, and the smell of hay mixed with the cool scent of morning dew. Out there, titles meant nothing. Horses did not care about executive offices, quarterly reports, or organizational charts. They cared about consistency. They cared about trust. That was one reason I enjoyed living on the edge of the community. Unfortunately, Linda Parker seemed determined to make my life more complicated. Over the following weeks, the complaints continued arriving. One claimed that stable lighting was excessive. Another questioned parking arrangements during riding lessons. A third suggested that trailer storage might violate community standards despite the fact that my property was outside the HOA's direct authority and fully compliant with county regulations. Every letter arrived neatly printed and professionally worded. Every accusation fell apart the moment it was examined. Still, responding took time. Time was apparently the weapon Linda preferred. One Thursday afternoon, I finished repairing a section of fencing and headed into the city for work. The transition always amused me. One moment I was wearing work boots and carrying fence tools. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a glass conference room overlooking downtown. The smell of fresh coffee replaced the scent of horses. Computer screens replaced pasture fences. Senior managers reviewed operational reports while department leaders discussed budgets and staffing plans. It was during one of those meetings that I saw a familiar name on an employee development report. Mark Parker. Strong performance metrics. Good leadership reviews. Reliable manager. I had known Mark professionally for years. He worked hard. He treated people fairly. And unlike his wife, he rarely drew attention to himself. What made the situation strange was that he had absolutely no idea where I lived. Our interactions stayed professional. We discussed projects, staffing needs, and operational goals. Nothing more. The connection between us existed only because I happened to recognize his last name months earlier when Linda introduced herself at an HOA gathering. At the time, I found it mildly interesting. Now it was becoming difficult to ignore. The following Saturday, another inspector arrived at the stables. This one focused on drainage and environmental compliance. Once again, everything passed without issue. As we finished reviewing documentation, a white SUV appeared at the end of the driveway. Linda stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying a folder beneath her arm. She did not approach directly. She simply watched from a distance while the inspector completed his work. The image stayed with me long after she left. Most people stop pushing when evidence proves them wrong. Linda seemed to push harder. Standing beside the paddock that evening, listening to horses move through the pasture under the orange glow of sunset, I realized something important. This was no longer about regulations. It was no longer about inspections. Linda had decided that my stables did not belong in her vision of the neighborhood. And people who become convinced they are protecting something important rarely stop on their own. By the time summer arrived, the inspections had become almost predictable. Every 10 days or so, someone would show up with a clipboard, a checklist, and a polite explanation about another concern that needed review. The horses barely reacted anymore. Neither did I. The smell of warm hay drifted through the barns while ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, pushing the afternoon heat out through the open doors. One inspector checked fencing standards. Another reviewed storage areas. A third examined event permits for riding lessons. Each visit ended exactly the same way. No violations. No citations. No problems. Yet somehow the complaints never stopped. What made the situation increasingly strange was how personal the pattern had become. Other properties in the area operated livestock facilities. Several maintained large outbuildings. Some generated far more traffic than my stables ever did. Yet none of them seemed to attract the attention that mine received. One evening, I attended a community meeting held inside the neighborhood clubhouse. The room smelled faintly of coffee and air conditioning, while residents filled rows of folding chairs. Linda stood at the front presenting updates about landscaping projects, community improvements, and budget planning. Everything seemed routine until the conversation shifted toward neighborhood appearance standards. Without mentioning me directly, she began discussing concerns about preserving property values and maintaining a certain image for the community. Several people nodded along. Then photographs appeared on a projection screen. My stables, my barns, my riding arena. Every image had been taken from public roads. Technically, there was nothing inappropriate about showing them. But the message was obvious. Linda wanted residents associating my property with a problem that did not actually exist. Sitting near the back of the room, I watched carefully. What interested me most was not Linda. It was the reactions around her. Many homeowners looked confused rather than concerned. Some appeared uncomfortable. A retired couple who frequently boarded horses at my facility exchanged puzzled glances. Others quietly reviewed the documentation attached to the presentation and seemed unable to find anything substantial. The meeting ended without any action being taken. Still, the attempt itself told me something important. Linda was running out of facts. That usually meant people started relying on perception instead. The next morning, I was back at corporate headquarters for a regional leadership meeting. Glass walls overlooked the city skyline while department managers discussed staffing forecasts and operational goals. Halfway through the session, Mark Parker delivered a presentation regarding one of his divisions. As always, he was prepared, professional, and thorough. Watching him work, it became even harder to understand the contrast between him and his wife. Mark focused on solutions. Linda seemed focused on conflict. After the meeting, we spent several minutes discussing upcoming projects. He mentioned attending a community function with his wife later that month and joked about how much free time HOA boards seemed to consume. I smiled but said nothing. He still had no idea we lived in the same neighborhood. As I drove back to the stables that evening, golden sunlight stretched across the pastures while horses grazed peacefully near the fence line. The property looked exactly as it always had. Quiet, well-maintained, completely compliant. Yet parked near the entrance was another unfamiliar vehicle. Another inspector. Another complaint. I shut off the truck and sat there for a moment staring through the windshield. Linda was no longer trying to find a violation. She was trying to create enough pressure that I would eventually decide the fight was not worth having. The problem for her was simple. She had no idea how patient I could be. The pressure campaign entered a new phase a few weeks later. Instead of inspections, the letters started changing. The envelopes still arrived with the same official appearance, but the language became more aggressive. Concerns about compliance turned into suggestions about community compatibility. Questions about permits became discussions about long-term neighborhood planning. Every document seemed carefully written to create one impression. My stables were becoming inconvenient. The smell of leather tack and fresh hay filled the barn one afternoon as I stood reviewing the latest letter. Outside, several riders were finishing a lesson in the arena while horses moved calmly along the fence line. Nothing about the property looked out of place. Nothing about the operation had changed. Yet according to the newest complaint, increased stable activity might negatively affect the future character of the community. I folded the letter and slipped it into a file cabinet that was already becoming crowded. What Linda did not realize was that every notice, every complaint, and every inspection report was being organized in chronological order. Not because I planned to fight, because I preferred facts over emotions. Facts tend to age well. Later that week, another HOA meeting was held. This time attendance was larger than usual. The room buzzed with conversation as residents discussed landscaping projects, traffic concerns, and upcoming community events. Linda appeared confident, as always. She moved through the crowd greeting homeowners and answering questions. Then she introduced a proposal involving future property use reviews near the edge of the neighborhood. Once again, my stables were the unspoken target. The discussion lasted nearly 30 minutes. Some residents supported additional oversight. Others questioned why the issue kept returning when no violations had ever been found. I listened quietly from the back of the room. What interested me most was how often Linda avoided discussing actual inspection results. Every report had cleared the property. Every review had confirmed compliance. Yet she continued speaking as though a problem existed somewhere just beyond reach. After the meeting ended, several homeowners approached me in the parking lot. One apologized for the repeated attention directed at my property. Another admitted the situation was beginning to feel personal. Their reactions confirmed something I had suspected for a while. Linda was slowly losing the support she expected. People might disagree about horses, barns, and land use, but most people recognized fairness when they saw it. The following Monday brought an entirely different world. I arrived at corporate headquarters before 7 in the morning. Sunlight reflected off the glass towers downtown, while employees filled elevators and conference rooms. By mid-morning, I was leading a regional strategy review attended by senior managers from multiple divisions. Among them was Mark Parker. As usual, he was professional, prepared, and respected by his team. During a break, we discussed staffing goals and operational challenges. Then he mentioned that his wife had been unusually busy with HOA matters lately. The comment almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because he clearly had no idea how busy she had been. I simply nodded and changed the subject. As the meeting continued, I found myself studying the organizational chart projected on the screen. Mark's division reported directly into one of the groups under my oversight. The connection could not have been clearer, yet neither Linda nor Mark seemed aware of it. Driving home that evening beneath a sky painted orange and gold by the setting sun, I had the distinct feeling that Linda was preparing one final push. And if I was right, she was about to walk much farther into this situation than she ever intended. The final push began on a Tuesday morning. I knew at the moment I opened my mailbox and found a thick certified envelope waiting inside. The smell of fresh rain lingered in the air from a storm that had passed overnight, and sunlight reflected from puddles scattered along the gravel driveway leading to the stables. Back inside my office, I opened the envelope and carefully reviewed every page. Linda had convinced the HOA board to authorize a comprehensive review of my property and stable operations. On paper, it looked official, professional, thorough. In reality, it was simply a larger version of everything she had already been doing for months. More inspections, more paperwork, more time, more pressure. I leaned back in my chair and looked toward the paddocks outside the window where several horses grazed peacefully beneath a bright blue sky. They had no idea they were apparently the center of an ongoing political campaign. Over the next 2 weeks, representatives from multiple departments visited the property. Fire safety personnel reviewed emergency access routes. Environmental officials examined drainage systems. County staff checked permits and operational records. Every visitor received the same treatment. Full cooperation, complete access, organized documentation. By the end of each inspection, the result never changed. No violations, no deficiencies, no action required. Yet Linda seemed determined to continue. One afternoon, I attended a county review meeting connected to the latest round of complaints. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner while officials reviewed reports spread across a long table. As the discussion progressed, I noticed something unusual. Several reviewers appeared increasingly frustrated, not with me, but with the repeated complaints themselves. One official quietly pointed out that every prior inspection had reached the same conclusion. Another noted that county resources were being spent investigating issues that consistently failed to produce findings. Nobody said Linda's name directly, but the message was becoming obvious. Her credibility was beginning to suffer. Meanwhile, life at the company continued moving forward. Quarterly planning season had arrived, which meant long meetings, operational reviews, and leadership evaluations. During one executive session, Mark Parker delivered one of the strongest performance presentations of the quarter. His division exceeded targets. Employee retention improved. Customer satisfaction scores were excellent. Watching him present, I felt genuinely impressed. The irony was impossible to ignore. Here was a capable manager earning praise from senior leadership, while completely unaware that his wife was spending enormous energy trying to force his direct supervisor out of a neighborhood dispute. The following weekend brought another HOA gathering. This one felt different. Residents asked harder questions. Several openly challenged the repeated focus on my property. Others wanted to know why no violations had ever been found despite months of investigations. Linda answered confidently, but I could see small cracks beginning to appear. Confidence sounds different when people stop automatically agreeing with you. As the meeting ended, she announced one final review process that she claimed would settle the matter once and for all. The room fell quiet. Standing near the back, I almost smiled. Because while Linda believed she was preparing for her biggest victory, I had just received an invitation to an upcoming corporate leadership event. An event where senior executives, department managers, and their spouses would all be attending together, including Mark Parker, including Linda Parker. And for the first time since this entire situation started, I had a feeling the truth was about to introduce itself. The corporate leadership event took place at a lakeside conference resort about 40 miles outside the city. The moment I arrived, I could tell it would be one of those evenings where professional relationships blended with personal introductions. Large glass windows overlooked the water. Soft music drifted through the reception hall. The smell of polished wood, fresh coffee, and catered meals filled the air as executives, managers, and their spouses gathered for networking sessions before the main presentations. I spent most of the afternoon reviewing final briefing materials and speaking with department leaders. By early evening, the ballroom had begun filling with guests. That was when I saw Mark Parker enter with Linda at his side. For a brief moment, neither of them noticed me. Mark was introducing his wife to several colleagues while Linda smiled confidently and surveyed the room. Then her eyes landed on me. The change was immediate. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a sudden pause that lasted a fraction of a second too long. I was standing near the stage speaking with another executive when recognition crossed her face. At first, she looked confused, then uncertain, then curious. She clearly knew she had seen me somewhere. The problem was that nothing about this environment matched the version of me she had constructed in her mind. Here, I was not wearing work boots. I was not repairing fences or walking through horse barns. I was standing among senior leadership preparing for the evening program. A few minutes later, Mark approached with Linda beside him. His expression was friendly as always. He introduced his wife, apparently unaware that we already knew each other. For a second, nobody spoke. Then I smiled and greeted Linda warmly. Her reaction was polite, but noticeably restrained. Before any awkward questions could emerge, Another executive called my name from across the room and asked me to prepare for the opening presentation. I excused myself and headed toward the stage area. From there, I could see much of the ballroom. Hundreds of employees and guests gradually found their seats. Conversations quieted. The lights dimmed slightly. Then the event host stepped to the podium and welcomed everyone. Several awards were presented first. Department achievements followed. Finally, the host began introducing the regional leadership team. One by one, names appeared on large screens positioned throughout the room. Applause followed each introduction. Then my name appeared. A photograph. A professional biography. My title. My responsibilities. The divisions under my oversight. I walked onto the stage to deliver the keynote address while the audience applauded. From where I stood, I could see nearly every table in the room. Most faces showed the same polite attention. One table stood out. Linda looked completely stunned. Mark looked equally surprised, although for a different reason. Unlike Linda, he was not realizing who I was. He was realizing who she already knew. Throughout the presentation, I remained focused on the event itself. Growth strategies, leadership principles, operational goals. Nothing unusual. Yet every time I glanced toward their table, I could see the same question forming in Linda's mind. How had she spent months targeting a man without ever learning who he was? And more importantly, what happened now that she knew? The event ended with a standing ovation, but that was not the part people remembered. What lingered afterward was the silence at Linda and Mark's table. As guests moved toward the reception area overlooking the lake, conversations filled the ballroom again. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed through the room. The smell of fresh coffee and catered desserts drifted through the air. Yet at one corner table, a very different conversation was beginning. I spent the next 30 minutes speaking with managers, answering questions about upcoming initiatives, and congratulating several teams on recent successes. Eventually, I noticed Mark approaching. Linda walked beside him. Neither looked angry. They looked stunned. Mark spoke first. He admitted he had no idea we lived in the same neighborhood. I smiled and told him that neither of us had ever discussed where we lived. Professionally, there had never been a reason to. Then his expression shifted. Slowly, the pieces began connecting in his mind. The stables, the inspections, the HOA meetings, the complaints. He looked toward Linda. She looked away. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The silence was uncomfortable, but not hostile. It was the silence people experience when they suddenly realize a situation is very different from what they believed. Linda finally spoke. Her voice was noticeably quieter than usual. She asked how long I had known Mark worked for me. I answered honestly. Almost from the beginning. I recognized the connection shortly after meeting her at an HOA gathering months earlier. Mark looked genuinely surprised. Then he asked the obvious question. Why had I never said anything? The answer was simple. Because it had nothing to do with the issue. His job performance and our neighborhood disagreements were completely separate matters. Mixing them would have been unfair to everyone involved. That response seemed to affect both of them more than anything else I could have said. Over the following days, the story spread quietly through the company. Not because I shared it. Because people talk. Several managers who attended the event had recognized Linda from previous HOA meetings. Others knew about my stables. Soon enough, everyone understood the basic outline of what had happened. The interesting part was the reaction. Nobody focused on authority. Nobody focused on titles. Instead, people focused on restraint. They focused on the fact that I had never mentioned the connection during inspections, complaints, or community disputes. At the next executive review meeting, Mark presented another strong operational update. Just like every previous review, he was evaluated based entirely on results. Nothing more. Nothing less. When the meeting ended, he thanked me privately. Not for protecting him, for treating him fairly. A week later, another HOA meeting took place. The atmosphere felt completely different from every meeting before it. Residents asked practical questions. Discussion stayed focused on actual community issues. There were no presentations about my stables. No new complaints. No calls for additional inspections. Most importantly, Linda spent far more time listening than speaking. Watching from the back of the room, I realized the reveal itself had not changed the situation. The truth had. For months, Linda believed she was dealing with someone who could simply be pressured into leaving. Now she understood she had spent all that time targeting a person she had never bothered to know. And that realization was beginning to change everything. The weeks that followed felt almost surreal. For nearly a year, every trip to the mailbox had carried the possibility of another complaint. Every community meeting carried the possibility of another accusation. Every unfamiliar vehicle entering the property made me wonder whether a new inspection was about to begin. Then suddenly, the noise stopped. The stables returned to being what they had always been, a place for horses, riders, and quiet mornings. One Saturday, I walked through the barns just after sunrise. Golden light filtered through the wooden slats while horses waited patiently for breakfast. The familiar smell of hay, leather, and fresh air filled the building. For the first time in months, there were no letters waiting on my desk, no inspection notices, no requests for additional reviews. Just silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of conflict. The peaceful silence that comes when people finally stop looking for problems that do not exist. Meanwhile, changes were happening inside the HOA as well. Several board members began pushing for more transparency regarding complaints and enforcement actions. Residents wanted to understand how much time and money had been spent pursuing investigations that repeatedly found nothing. The discussions were professional, but they were honest. People had started asking questions that should have been asked much earlier. Why were resources focused on one property? Why were repeated inspections approved despite clean reports? Why had assumptions been treated as evidence? Linda found herself answering difficult questions from the same community that once supported every initiative she proposed. To her credit, she handled the situation far better than I expected. Instead of becoming defensive, she gradually acknowledged that mistakes had been made. Not all at once, not dramatically, but little by little, the tone changed. During one HOA meeting, she even publicly emphasized the importance of relying on documented facts rather than personal opinions when evaluating property concerns. Sitting near the back of the room, I almost smiled when I heard it. Months earlier, that sentence would have ended half our disagreements before they started. At work, things remained exactly as they always had. Mark continued performing well. His department continued exceeding expectations. Quarterly reviews continued according to established standards. One afternoon after a leadership meeting, he stopped by my office. The city skyline stretched beyond the windows while afternoon sunlight reflected off neighboring buildings. He thanked me again for never allowing the neighborhood situation to influence professional decisions. I told him the same thing I had said before. It was never even a consideration. Professional responsibility means treating people fairly whether circumstances are convenient or not. As he left, I realized something interesting. The reveal everyone expected to create drama had actually done the opposite. Instead of creating conflict, it had exposed the difference between authority and character. Authority comes from titles. Character comes from how people behave when they have those titles. Back at the stables, autumn arrived in full force. Leaves turned gold and red along the riding trails. Cooler air moved across the pastures. Weekend lessons remained busy. Families continued visiting. Life moved forward. Looking around the property one evening as the sun disappeared behind the hills, I realized that Linda's campaign had ultimately failed for a simple reason. She spent months trying to prove who I was. She never took the time to learn who I actually was. And once the truth became impossible to ignore, the entire story changed. Winter arrived quietly that year. Frost covered the pasture fences in the early mornings, and thin clouds drifted above the hills surrounding the community. The horses seemed to enjoy the colder weather. They moved through the fields with an energy that always returned when summer finally released its grip on the valley. Standing near the main barn one morning, listening to the familiar sounds of hooves against packed ground and the gentle rustle of hay, I found myself thinking about how much had changed over the previous year. On the surface, almost nothing looked different. The stables were still there. The neighborhood was still there. The same roads connected the same homes. Yet the relationships between the people living there had shifted in ways nobody could have predicted. The HOA eventually adopted new procedures regarding complaints and enforcement reviews. Documentation standards became stricter. Repeated complaints required stronger supporting evidence. Community discussions became more transparent. Residents wanted decisions based on facts rather than assumptions. Ironically, those changes improved the neighborhood for everyone, including me, including Linda. During one of the final HOA meetings before the holidays, I watched from the back of the room as board members discussed future projects. The atmosphere was calm. professional, productive. At one point, Linda thanked several residents for encouraging more open communication within the community. The statement was simple, but it carried weight. Growth rarely arrives through victories. More often, it arrives through uncomfortable lessons. After the meeting ended, she approached me outside beneath strings of holiday lights hanging from the clubhouse entrance. The cold air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke from nearby fireplaces. She admitted that she had spent too much time assuming things about people she never truly knew. Then she surprised me by apologizing. Not dramatically, not publicly, just honestly. I accepted. There was nothing else to gain from holding on to old frustrations. By then, the story had already taught everyone involved what it needed to teach. A few days later, I attended another leadership review at corporate headquarters. Mark's division finished the year stronger than ever. His team earned recognition for operational excellence, and his future within the company looked promising. Watching him accept congratulations from colleagues, I felt satisfied knowing that professional fairness had survived every opportunity to become personal. That mattered more than any reveal ever could. Months earlier, many people would have expected the story to end with power being used. Instead, it ended with power being ignored. Looking back, that was the real twist. Linda believed authority was the most important thing about me. It never was. The most important thing was restraint. Anyone can use influence when circumstances favor them. Character is revealed when they choose not to. On the final evening before Christmas, I walked through the stables after sunset. Soft lights illuminated the barns while the horses settled in for the night. Snow flurries drifted through the air beyond the open doors. Everything felt peaceful, familiar, exactly the way it should. As I locked the office and stepped outside, I looked across the property toward the neighborhood beyond the trees. For months, people had tried to define me by appearances. A stable owner, a horse guy, an executive, a boss. The truth was much simpler. I was just a neighbor who wanted to be treated fairly. In the end, the inspections found nothing. The complaints proved nothing. The titles changed nothing. What changed everything was the moment people finally stopped making assumptions and started paying attention to the truth. The horses never cared who signed performance reviews. Funny enough, neither did I.